No whales anymore. Salman Rushdie, in a 1984 essay, drew on George Orwell's metaphor of life inside a whale, insulated from worldly reality, to note that today's artists live outside the whale, in a world that is in fact whaleless, where there are no corners in which we can escape the hubbub and turmoil. Given Rushdie's later situation of permanent hiding, this comment is particularly poignant. It also belies the major argument of the thousands of liberal supporters of Rushdie, who rely on the idea that a work of art is basically to be seen as independent of context, that one has to be free to write whatever one wants, regardless of consequences. This celebration of the text in itself, with the studied neglect of authorial intention, and even greater neglect of audience reception, is in line both with the current mood of literary criticism, and the ideology of the liberal state. The rally around Salman Rushdie gave at the same time a new vigor and unity to the intellectual community, and a fresh chance for denunciations, on the part of politicians of the West's current nemesis, the world of Islam. Now, obviously no right-minded person would support the idea of a death penalty for Salman Rushdie. Indeed, we should all condemn it vociferously. No one denies the limitations on personal liberties in various Muslim societies, which reach their apogee in a fatwa, extended halfway around the world, to reach a naturalized citizen of Britain. But, as Talal Asad points out, along with our solidarity with Salman Rushdie in this sense, we can profit from examining the aggressively enthusiastic support of this beleaguered writer, for what it can tell us about the state of Western intellectual culture. There is a great deal of censorship in the world today, much imprisonment, many executions. Why has this case in particular inspired so passionately the imagination of the intellectual community? One angle on the Rushdie controversy might be provided by looking further into the new Cold War between religion and secularism, as Juergensmeyer puts it, particularly between the Western secular state and Islamic nationalism. This is certainly an important part of the dynamic here, also related to the received Western view of Orthodox Sikhs, as religious fanatics. But for the purposes of the current essay, I would like to emphasize the sense in which westernized writers like Salman Rushdie have become important symbols for our supposed dialogue with the non-West. As Tim Brennan notes, such writers are immediately celebrated by Western literati, as providing an inside view of various third world societies, though they in fact write for a clearly Western target audience, and live lives far removed from their distant origins. Rushdie used to be heralded as a kind of spokesperson for Islamic South Asia, for immigrant communities, and so on, until that same supposed constituency started burning his book. It turned out that he was more of a spokesperson for what the intellectual world thought Islam was like, or the immigrant experience was like. In embracing him, it could pride itself on its cultural open-mindedness, while not really taking the risk of confronting truly alien ways of thinking. Since it's easier to converse with Salman Rushdie than the Ayatollah Khomeini and his ilk, by all means let's make it possible for Rushdie to continue to function. Shame, praised as particularly insightful with regard to post-colonial Pakistan, is so Western, that it is unreadable by all except the most elite Pakistanis. Concepts like fundamentalism and terrorism, which form the cornerstones of most discussions of Khalistani Sikhs, are to my mind, words we use, to comfort ourselves about our own civility, while excusing our inability to actually grapple with radical others. They are accusatory and dismissive, and therefore not useful in the endeavor to understand. In his discussion of anthropology's interlocutors, Said describes the difference between the évalu, taken into confidence by the French colonial regime, and the person who refuses to talk, deciding that only a radically antagonistic, perhaps violent riposte, is the only interlocution that is possible with colonial power. Despite our discipline's admirable new insistence on dialogue, it remains easier for us to exchange ideas with those who will come into our parlor, than with those who, refusing to leave their weapons at the door, challenge us, condemn us, even sentence us, with rude ignorance of the rules of the academic freedom game. When we see a volume like the response to Oberoi, just put out by Jasbir Singh Man, Surinder Singh Sodhi, and Gurbaksh Singh Gill, much of it strikes us as way beyond the norms of accepted academic exchange. There are ad hominem remarks, tirades against the whole of Western social science, defenses of scriptural dogma, and so on. Harjot Oberoi, seeing that Orthodox Sikhs seem to be unwilling to enter the conversation on his terms, now refrains from responding to this explosion, which is easily brushed aside as evidence of narrow-minded zealotry. I suggest that anthropology, of all disciplines, shall have to come to terms with the radically alien quality of some of its most important interlocutors, those who reject interlocution on the terms we prefer. Religious fundamentalists like the Orthodox Sikhs, many of whom now carry not only swords, but AK-47s, making them terrorists as well, are a case in point. Is it futile to think of productive dialogue with people who intransigently refuse to hear divergent interpretations of their community's history, who respond to investigation into the textual sources of Sikh belief, with cries of blasphemy, who are ready with accusations of government conspiracies, at the slightest sign of an anti-Khalistan bias? Most Western scholars of religion are, sadly, coming to the conclusion that this is the case. My experience with Orthodox Sikhs indicates that such radical interlocution is in fact quite possible. It means, however, accepting a compromise framework, in which a dialogue between equals becomes possible, and this compromise will antagonize those most fixed on the notion of inviolable academic sovereignty. Such sovereignty, held up as a wall of separation between the politicized real world, and the supposedly non-politicized République des Lettres, is an effect of the professionalization of intellectuals, that has taken place over the past half-century in the Western metropolis. The Gramscian concept of the organic intellectual, the public intellectual whose voice is engaged in the affairs of the world, rather than distant from it, takes a backseat today to the image of the academic specialist, the expert whose credibility rests on his mastery of an increasingly narrow body of knowledge, and on a critical distance from political debate. As an antidote to this kind of withdrawal from public discourse, Said suggests an amateur, non-professional, engaged approach to intellectual life. With Noam Chomsky, Gore Vidal, and a handful of others, Said insists on the critical permeability of the membrane that holds academic dialogue apart from that of the rest of the world. I suggest that insofar as this membrane is not permeable, accepting exchanges of views in both directions, academia becomes, simply, impotent. Postmodern interpretations of the intellectual, which conceive of the intellectual not as legislator of absolute truths, but as interpreter between communities, can help anthropologists construct viable frameworks for dialogue, that enable conversation with radical others, without denying the continuing importance of academic freedom. As interpreters, we want to establish a terrain on which we can be mutually intelligible, as a logical precondition to responsible assertions of truth as we see it. For Orthodox Sikhs, the framing of a conversational terrain must take into account respect for the sacred scriptures and the historical gurus, as well as some recognition of the current political dilemmas facing the Sikh community. Our professional academic terrain is obviously contoured by ideas about the integrity of research, and the importance of the free exchange of ideas. Are these unbridgeable? I don't think so. One can recognize and acknowledge publicly what the sacred scriptures and historical gurus mean to Orthodox Sikhs, while at the same time offering textual or historical critique. One can state that Sikh identity is at the moment closely tied up with politics, that hinge partly on the separateness or lack of it, of the Sikh community, and go on to present one's own ideas about group boundaries. One can work for human rights in Punjab, and criticize at the same time the definite atrocities committed by Khalistanis. One can respect the militant resistance, yet suggest that leaders have further thinking to do on the nature of an eventual Khalistan. Orthodox Sikhs, upholding a religious tradition in which truth is pure steel, as they say, are in my opinion ready to recognize other interpretations of truth, if perceived as sincerely offered, that is respectfully and in good faith. The reason why Orthodox Sikhs are upset with Oberoi, is in fact, only superficially related to his ideas about Sanatana Sikhs, and other aspects of Sikh history. What they are upset about, is his unwillingness to establish a common terrain, to treat practicing Sikhs as colleagues, in the endeavor of understanding their religious tradition. This is not the same thing as inviting them to join into the liberal academic terrain. Oberoi writes about Sikh history from inside a whale, seemingly without concern for those whose deepest religious sensibilities are at stake, and whose political fates may hang on the question of identities and boundaries. I don't think it is bowing down to censorship to suggest that one could effectively deconstruct Sikh identity, while acknowledging the current human rights abuses being perpetrated against the Sikhs as a community, however constructed that community may seem to academicians, or that one could discuss scriptural disputes while recognizing and stating the viewpoints of those who hold one version as sacred. One telling aspect of my own interactions with Orthodox Sikhs is the way in which these interactions are received by colleagues, some of whom seem to feel that willingness to engage in dialogue on compromised terms, respect for the Guru Granth Sahib as axiomatic for example, implies a total suspension of critical judgment on my part. One even questioned the appropriateness of touching one's head to the floor before the Guru Granth Sahib at a Gurudwara, a part of the worship service every participant performs out of respect. That Sikhs would take this gesture as indicating the willingness of a visitor submit to their authority, is absurd. When Orthodox Sikh interlocutors are also involved in an armed insurgency, the hackles go up even further. You'll lose your credibility as a neutral observer if you talk to them, sort of thing. This is plain silly, and undermines our discipline's claim, or hope to be able to engage in serious cross-cultural dialogue. I talk to Orthodox Sikhs, to separatist Sikhs, and disagree with much of what they tell me. But it's their religion, and their war, that I am trying to understand, on their terms as well as others. And in fact, being engaged in conversation with them, enables a degree of criticism that has the potential to be effective, rather than simply reacted against. The fact is, that however much many of us disagree with fundamentalism per se, fundamentalists will not be deterred by our condemnation, from on high. We retain a level of personal integrity, at the cost of actually ameliorating the worst aspects of religious orthodoxy, and stay self-righteously neutral in the middle of an armed conflict, at the cost of its perpetuation. Blindly condemning terrorism provokes nothing more, as far as I can see, than further terror. The worldliness of the texts we write, implicates us in the problems of this whaleless world. It is failure to recognize the context of his writing, that is in the end, the central problem with Harjot Oberoi's book. He has written an account of Sikh history that is fascinating, informative, and theoretically challenging, and he did so in a climate in which this act alone required some amount of courage. I focus on his work here not to deprecate what is in fact a substantial achievement, but to point to the shadowy region behind and around it, full of prayer, and drawn swords, which gives it its ultimate meaning. Had this netherworld been brought explicitly into the text, the work would not have suffered, I suggest, and we of the academic world would be closer to, not further from, productive collaboration with the people we study. In the middle of the discussion with Sikhs about Oberoi's book, and what it meant for them and for me, Joyce Pettigrew's volume on the Punjab conflict came out. The Sikhs had a copy of it before I did, demonstrating once again that we are seriously deluding ourselves, if we think we write solely or even primarily for other scholars. When culture has become politicized, every work about culture has a political impact, and is read and responded to in political terms. This is simply a fact of life, in doing anthropology in the highly politicized late 20th century. Like it or not, our work has unignorable real-world consequences. Amarjit attended the American Anthropological Association meetings with me in 1993. In our forum, he kept his kirpan tucked tactfully under a suit jacket, though his bright saffron turban made him, to put it mildly, conspicuous. Since I was giving a paper on Sikh separatism, we talked about whether his presence at the meetings might be taken as some attempt at surveillance or censorship, whether my talk would carry less credibility because of it. Looking back on this incident, its absurdity, or tragedy seems evident. While it is perfectly acceptable to have a turbaned, sordid Sikh as an informant, to accept one as a colleague at a professional meeting, is a step that not all are ready to take. The potential loss of authority, represented by the attendance of such a person, at the sanctum sanctorum of our discipline, is scary. Though Johannes Fabian pointed out the clearly non-reciprocal quality of anthropology's dialogue with its subjects, the continuing sense that we are not coeval with them, it is still easier for most of us to visualize an anthropologist in a Gurudwara, than a Sikh at the American Anthropological Association. We now see representatives of various indigenous groups at the AAA, but I suggest these are relatively safe, relatively powerless, entrants to our discussions. Yet if we are to avoid the kind of impasse we now see between Oberoi and the Orthodox Sikh community, we shall have to come to grips with the notion of interlocution, with not only radically different, but occasionally radically opposed others. There is no more field to go to, separate from ourselves, and unable or unwilling to talk back. The field is at the American Anthropological Association, sword and all. The alienation of the academic study of religion from religious people, to the point where willingness to truly converse with fundamentalists, is taken as a symptom of irretrievable loss of integrity, and the alienation of the academic study of group identity, from people in groups, to the point where an anthropologist has to caution others, not to use the names preferred by group members themselves, represent serious failures in communication, between the ivory tower and the world. Meisher-Lees and others point to a similar problem in their classic article on the disjunction between postmodernism and feminism. Just as women are asserting themselves as subjects, they note, academia wants to do away with subjectivity. Academia seems to have declared the end of modernism, the end of grand narratives of emancipation, before everyone has had the chance to reap their benefits. We deconstruct boundaries at the very historical moment that those boundaries are being mobilized for political resistance. We challenge the sanctity of religious texts, as those texts are giving fresh inspiration to increasing numbers of believers. It is not surprising that people disparage academics in light of this scenario, that some give up on talking with us altogether. Feminist scholars have already shown that there is much to gain by redefining the contours of academic inquiry, with explicit attention to the outside-the-whale consequences of scholarship, in a world in which our priorities seem at the moment to be at odds with those of people we study. I suggest here that taking the risk of talking with radically different others, on jointly defined terms, in other people's parlors and in our own, will enhance our understanding of the resistive identities that form such a key part of the late 20th century global order. Not only will failure to engage in such dialogue impoverish academia, but it can lead to a dangerous downward spiral, into Manichaean intransigence, on the part of those excluded from the debate. Academia will then itself share the blame for the intolerance of the fundamentalists, and the chauvinism of the separatists. For Salman Rushdie, indeed, we should all condemn it vociferously. No one denies the limitations on personal liberties in various Muslim societies, which reach their apogee in a fatwa, extended halfway around the world, to reach a naturalized citizen of Britain. But, as Talal Asad points out, along with our solidarity with Salman Rushdie in this sense, we can profit from examining the aggressively enthusiastic support of this beleaguered writer, for what it can tell us about the state of Western intellectual culture. There is a great deal of censorship in the world today, much imprisonment, many executions, opposed dialogue with the non-West. As Tim Brennan notes, such writers are immediately celebrated by Western literati, as providing an inside view of various third world societies, though they in fact write for a clearly Western target audience, and live lives far removed from their distant origins. Rushdie used to be heralded as a kind of spokesperson for Islamic South Asia, for immigrant communities, and so on, until that same supposed constituency started burning his book. It turned out that he was more of a spokesperson for what the intellectual world thought Islam was like, or the immigrant experience. Why has this case in particular inspired so passionately the imagination of the intellectual community? One angle on the Rushdie controversy might be provided by looking further into the new Cold War between religion and secularism, as Juergensmeyer puts it, particularly between the Western secular state and Islamic nationalism. This is certainly an important part of the dynamic here, also related to the received Western view of Orthodox Sikhs as religious fanatics. But for the purposes of the current essay, I would like to emphasize the sense in which westernized writers like Salman Rushdie have become important symbols for our No whales anymore. Salman Rushdie, in a 1984 essay, drew on George Orwell's metaphor of life inside a whale, insulated from worldly reality, to note that today's artists live outside the whale, in a world that is in fact whaleless, where there are no corners in which we can escape the hubbub and turmoil. Given Rushdie's later situation of permanent hiding, this comment is particularly poignant. It also belies the major argument of the thousands of liberal supporters of Rushdie, who rely on the idea that a work of art is basically to be seen as independent of context, that one has to be free to write whatever one wants, regardless of consequences. This celebration of the text in itself, with the studied neglect of authorial intention, and even greater neglect of audience reception, is in line both with the current mood of literary criticism, and the ideology of the liberal state. The rally around Salman Rushdie gave at the same time a new vigor and unity to the intellectual community, and a fresh chance for denunciations, on the part of politicians of the West's current nemesis, the world of Islam. Now, obviously no right-minded person would support the idea of a death penalty